Welcome back to the South African Morning. Now, Jacob Zuma's military doctors have filed a report on his fitness to stand trial. The National Prosecuting Authority confirmed that the report was received, but said the contents are confidential. The deadline to hand over the report was last Friday. Zuma is reported to have had a surgical procedure on Saturday. He was initially hospitalized earlier this month for medical observation for an undisclosed illness. The corruption trial is set to resume next month.
Very few South Africans trust public institutions and their leaders. That's the finding of the recent Afro-barometer survey. It showed that trust in elected representatives is exceptionally weak. Well, let's speak now to project leader at the South African Reconciliation Barometer, Mikhail Musa. Welcome, Mikhail. Good to have you with us this morning. Now, Mikhail, let's start with your paper that you recently posted. And I mean, the public trust in institutions show that nearly 60% of South Africans trust President Cyril Ramaphosa just a little or not at all. Please delve into that.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Baron. It's good to chat to you again. So the paper that we published recently was based off the Afro-barometer survey, which we conducted earlier this year. So we went into field around May and June of 2021. It's a nationally representative public opinion survey. So we went across the country in all 9 provinces using a nationally representative sample of South Africans to make sure that we reflect as best as possible national public opinion. And we asked South Africans a series of questions about governance, their socioeconomic status. And one of the questions that we wanted to ask is how much trust do they have in their elected leaders and representatives? And what we find is that South Africans' trust in their elected representatives is at an all-time low. So we've been asking this question for about 15 years in South Africa, so we can compare levels of trust over time. And what we find is South Africans are more distrustful of their representatives and leaders now than at any other time since we've been surveying. So trust in the president, as you rightly mentioned, is very low at the moment, but it has been for quite a long time as well. So actually the levels of trust that we see in 2021 are actually slightly higher than the levels of trust we saw in 2015 under former President Jacob Zuma's second term. But what this essentially means for the here and now is that the sort of tough reforms that President Cyril Ramaphosa will have to implement going forward, whether it comes to the economy or health restrictions, he doesn't have the same sort of social capital and legitimacy that previous presidents would have had in earlier times. So I think the important thing to keep in mind is that trust has been eroded over many years.
Yeah, I can't help but think that the recent unrest in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng and the COVID-19 pandemic, corruption as well, has something to do with this.
Of course, yeah. So, I mean, as I said, the survey was conducted in May and June, so this was before the unrest that we saw in July. But I think what the value of the survey does is that it provides a lot of the context as to why things happened, perhaps. So what we also see is that very few South Africans trust the police, which might explain why, you know, the police had such a difficult time of securing legitimacy in their constituencies. There's very little trust in local councils, for example. So local authorities are have a very weak sense of a response to their constituencies. So this somewhat explains why the riots were sort of allowed to take place or took place in the way that they did. But of course, you know, we're living in extraordinary times, so we do have to take this into consideration. But one of the things that maybe, you know, almost boosted the president's authority or trust rating is his sort of prominence over the last year because of the pandemic.
Now, Mikhail, there's also major distrust when it comes to the IEC, and with the upcoming elections, surely this is going to have a major impact on the elections. And 36% of South Africans, as you mentioned in your paper, don't trust the IEC. Will this have a big impact on the nature and the outcome of the elections?
Yes, I almost am quite certain that this will have an impact on the elections, and I think we're already seeing it. So one of the big stories from the last few years with our national election results has not so much been the decline of the ANC, but actually the decline in voter turnout. So not only are registered voters not turning out to vote, but more and more young people who are becoming eligible to vote are not even being registered on the voters roll. So I think this is where the distrust in the IEC is coming from, is that many people do not see elections as an effective form of participation. They don't think elections bring about any form of substantive change, certainly to their socioeconomic circumstances. So the idea of an electoral commission that is solely tasked with carrying out elections freely and fairly is not something that really will affect most people's lives. So I think a lot of the crisis that we've seen with the IEC over the last few days perhaps speaks to why people distrust it as well. But I definitely think it's also linked to South Africans' broader distrust in elections as a means of participating in democracy.
Now, interestingly enough, and I want to indulge this, you mentioned that 2 out of 3 people are willing to give up elections if an unelected government could provide jobs, housing, and other basic services. Please delve into this one.
Sure, yeah. So again, this is a question we've been asking for about 15 years in South Africa. And what we've consistently found is that a majority of people would be willing to give up elections if an unelected government could provide some essential services. But what we find in 2021 is that far more people would be willing. So we find that 46% of respondents to this question said they would be very willing to do so. So this is much higher than in any previous survey we've conducted. And I think there's 2 important points to elaborate from this finding. One is that I think this finding serves as an indictment over the last 15 or 20 years of democratic governance in South Africa, where people have had the rights to participate in a democracy, but haven't seen their socioeconomic circumstances change to any significant degree. We've seen the unemployment numbers come out this week, and things are getting worse, if not staying the same. And the second point, I think, is that people would be quite willing to give up certain democratic rights and freedoms that are so hard fought for in South Africa, and of course so recent, just to secure some material improvements to their lives. When we look at the respondents that would be most willing to do this, we find that younger South Africans are much more keen on doing this. Urban and more educated South Africans as well are more keen on giving up elections, whereas older South Africans, perhaps those who live in rural areas, perhaps people who have a greater sense of attachment to the ANC or the struggle for liberation, these people are much less likely to want to give up elections.
Thank you so much, Mikhail Musa from the South African Reconciliation Barometer. Now, still